Hello, I'm Dr. Amy Scott Douglas. I consider it a great honor, and it means so much to me, both professionally and personally, to have been asked to introduce our Bisson lecturer this year. And I'm very grateful to my colleague, Dr. Tanya Howe, Director of Graduate Studies in English and Humanities, for giving me the opportunity to do this. When I say that it's a great honor to introduce our speaker today, I don't mean that just as an expression. Peter Donaldson is one of the best Shakespeare scholars and teachers the world has. He is also my adopted mentor, my Shakespeare studies papa, if you will, and I love and adore him as a human being. And so this is a really special treat to introduce him today, coincidentally, Shakespeare's 450th birthday, April 23rd, 2014. Pete Donaldson's scholarship on Shakespeare on film is, to my mind, the best scholarship written on Shakespeare film adaptation. From the first graduate seminar I ever taught, I have held Pete's work up to my students as an example of how to approach writing about Shakespeare film adaptation. What makes Pete's writing so good is that I always learn something new about both the film and the Shakespeare play itself. And moreover, the ideas and the knowledge that a person takes away after having read Pete's work are important ideas. Pete's ideas about Shakespeare have fundamentally to do with the human condition, with love and loss, with pain and healing, with every person's desire to be different and every person's desire to belong, to be loved, to be valued. My favorite book on Shakespeare films is Pete's Shakespearean Film, Shakespearean Directors, published in 1990. Pete's chapter on Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet film, this is the one starring Olivia Hussey and Leonard Whiting, or the one with Romeo who looks a little bit like Zac Efron, depending on your age and frame of reference, called Let Lips Do What Hands Do, is a beautifully written study of the way that Franco Zeffirelli films relationships in Shakespeare's play, desire and loyalty between Juliet and Romeo, the triangulated bonds between Lady Capulet, her husband, and her nephew Tybalt. Peter Donaldson is professor of literature at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Ford Foundation professor in the Humanities, and the director of MIT's Global Shakespeare's Initiative, fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and has held research fellowships from the NEH and ACLS. He is a pioneer in electronic and digital Shakespeare. Please join me in welcoming him as our 2014 Bisson lecturer.
Thank you, Amy. I couldn't hope for a more gracious introduction. And I just want to say, in return, without lengthening the occasion very much, that Amy is the most remarkable mentee or younger scholar that I've had the pleasure to work with. And I'm so glad that she's here at Marymount and that her work is prospering. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to talk about my involvement with digital Shakespeare and the phases that it's gone through over the years. And I'm going to do so in part because I think we're at a juncture in digital Shakespeare, which after all has been going on for a long time. If you think about text computing, it's been going on for 50 years and more. If you think about multimedia, then probably I was there in the beginning of that movement in the early 90s, and that now is undergoing some very important changes, and changes that I think require us to return to what the original vision of what we were trying to accomplish is. People talk about how technology can direct things, and of course the great metaphor, the great metaphor creating and setting institution now is the web. But we occasionally, people say history moves in terza rima, moves forward, and then you have to move back, be inspired by that line 2 lines ago and go another step forward. I think we are at a point where we have to return to some of the things that I and half a dozen others at least were trying to accomplish in the early 90s. Fine-grained, linked collections that linked text to images and to videos in a way that I've learned to call living variorum. It was the vision of the living variorum. That's my collaborator, Larry Friedlander at Stanford's phrase in his early experiments, which were about the same time as mine in this field, and we brought him to MIT to collaborate on what would be the first instantiation of that vision in a collection. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the global Shakespeare archive that we're involved in now, and about how we can move to a future where the original vision of linking text, video, and image extends to linking projects to one another, so that you can feel that you're in a unified environment, but moving from text to facsimile to an appropriate image to an appropriate specific passage in a film or a video of a theatrical production. We certainly haven't got there yet, but we've made some very good initial strides in the last couple of years. So with that, I'll start the presentation. In some way, I started thinking about this kind of thing in the 80s and how Shakespeare teaching might be different. My own mentor was one of these charismatic Shakespeare teachers. They're not in as much fashion anymore as they used to be. They were wonderful, and I loved my own mentor immensely, and he motivated me. Sometimes people say you need 3 mentors, I was lucky to have one, but one to motivate you, one to teach you how to find a problem or a question, and the third to teach you how to do the work, how the work is to be done. But he did this one piece marvelously, but he did it as I'm doing it now, from the front of the room, with the great book, and he would hold up the great book. And in fact, the legend was that he was born on Shakespeare's birthday, and he actually died at 52, and people were saying maybe, but poor guy, but he died young. He was a brilliant scholar, but the mode then was an authoritative book, which people knew to be something of a myth because the text is variant. And every competent scholar knows that a great many of those variant readings cannot be decided among with any certainty, right? So while the book has all that stuff in the back, it's in 4-point type, and nobody ever learns to read it until graduate school, if then, right? And this is no disgrace to the Riverside Shakespeare. It was the leading example of that, and it's still a magnificent accomplishment. But it did a lot to shape the notion of the great man, and it almost always was a great man, right? Rather than being a great woman as well at the podium, with an authoritative book and an authoritative opinion about what that book meant. So this is now changed, but it's worth remembering. And it changed. A lot of it changed from, let's say, early 80s to mid 90s. I would say performance matters. Performance studies matter. No longer do we think of performance as attempts to imitate the text in some peripheral way, right? They create new meanings. They create new ways of reading that can cycle back into someone who's reading the text rather than watching a performance. It could even be the center of a person's whole scholarly life as well as artistic or theatrical life. Change across time and culture matters, where and when, and the relationship between Shakespeare and his afterlife has likewise become more dialogic, where we don't automatically reject a reading that happens in a modern medium created by a modern artist as un-Shakespearean. That's what another of my mentors, Barbara Hodgson, called the fidelity model, right? But there's enough trouble about fidelity in all sorts of other ways. We don't need to be faithful to an imagined certitude about what an artist who lived 400 years ago was. We probably need to live up to and be adequate to what a great artist he was, and the ways in which we construe and take the ways in which we construe and remake Shakespeare seriously as a way of honoring him, rather than imagining we knew exactly what he wanted. So instead of a fidelity model, we tend to have a more dialogic model where we value the quality of the engagement of an artist with the Shakespearean material on whatever terms that artist has chosen to work with the material. So that's a big shift. Not everyone agrees, maybe not everyone here agrees, but there certainly was a sea change in that period. So I began to think in the 80s of, well, how would you, if the text varies, if the afterlife is an important part of the text, almost, say, a part of an expanded text that includes the afterlife in illustration or commentary or film versions, how would you map, publish, navigate, and explore that realm? And I think that dream came in part from my being at MIT and seeing things like the early movie map of Aspen, California, where you could drive, and it seemed like a wonder now, and now anyone can do it with their Google map, go down each street in Aspen as if you were driving a car with a mouse and a computer. So that movie map made me think, well, Shakespeare's more important. Well, I don't. Maybe somebody's from Aspen and doesn't think so, but it's of more universal importance to understand the Shakespeare universe than the Aspen universe. Maybe. How could we do that? How could we move through media seamlessly? You know, going from a line of text to the materials relevant to that. How could we map that matrix and move through it using a computer? And that's what my projects have been involved in doing. Wait a second. So what we do, and this is the Shakespeare project at MIT, and we've been now formally in existence for 23 years. So we began in earnest in the early 90s. We create online collections that embody this vision of a linked Shakespeare universe. We build and adapt annotation tools that allow students to work with text, images, and videos in one environment, to write their own multimedia essays and conduct discussions. And basically, that's the core task, though it's changed form, as you'll see. And I thought very early on, if I'm going to try to do this, the worst thing would be to try to map everything or do everything. That the real task was to find what would be the part of this vision that could be embodied in real time and fundable to do so, because it takes money, that would drive the field along. So that's what I've tried to do. I've not tried to build an immense archive, although the Global Shakespeare Archive is part of my work, but to say what's going to help the world to move into this linked Shakespeare universe that I imagine best. And so the first project we did, it turned out we wanted students to be able to use it and not just browse, right? So we didn't even have the word browse, you know, in a time. This was before Mosaic. So we had, because of technological reasons, we had to do the student part and the research part in separate technologies. So for the research part, we decided to create an environment that had every variant state of every page that was a variant in the famous Shakespeare folio, 1623. And this project still is the only one that has all the variant states of the text in facsimile. And so in a way, it's the most complete folio collection. For Hamlet, we decided, again, making prudential decision, it'd be great to have it for all plays, but let's have an image collection of 1,000 to 1,500 images for Hamlet. And this is starting in '93. And link those to each line to which they're relevant. And several films, and we wound up with 3 or 4 in part because they were ones we could get copyright for. We had copyright permission for the Burton Hamlet, for example, and a couple of others. We had 3 or 4 films. So you could move from a line of text to the relevant place in a facsimile, in an image collection, or in a film, and get it to play just where that line began, or the one next to it, or before. And this is the symbol of our variant Shakespeare, because in fact the Shakespeare portrait is variant, and it's almost microscopic, but you'll see in some of them he looks a little more like John the Baptist than in other ones. And this has to do with subtleties in the shading, and in one case they made a feeble attempt to make his hair look a little more natural by making a few stray strands stick out a little more than that. So really and truly, but you have to, so that you can hardly see it, but there are, even his face is this great pop culture icon of Shakespeare's face, was variant in the folio. So, and this was the interface, where you'd click on a line, bring it to the top, and then you'd get a parade of images. The first page of the first play in the folio is the beginning of The Tempest. Not chronologically, but that's where it is in the folio. And you'll see we started learning lessons, and it's also the one that has the most variant states. So the page exists in 4 different states, and that's the most. There's others that are 3 or 2, but only The Tempest has 1. And this is the earliest, and you could tell that from the initial capital. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's upside down. And so the compositor, who for some reason didn't get fired and continued to work, as Hinman showed, all 5 compositors worked on the whole of the folio, but he made a very terrible mistake. So the first character in Shakespeare, the first alphabetic character, first piece of type, is inverted. And one of the things we use this for with students immediately, as I was saying, you learn more from a material object or its image than you do from a printed book. One is immediately you can never forget that it's possible to make a mistake, in setting the type. Another, though, was something I didn't know at first, that these pages were subject to time, and what are these red lines? And it turns out that there was a practice in 18th century collecting where if you didn't have a good page, you could take a crummy page and cut it and paste it into a better piece of paper and disguise the join with red pen lines, right? So it gives you a little piece of the history of the book and the tenuous and very human links that are necessary for us to get the book into our hands, and at every stage in which error and alternative states are possible. And then we had image collection, and as you can imagine, we did wind up with 1,500 images from Folger Library, and collected by Alan Young. The way we work is collaboratively, so he was writing a book on Shakespeare art in, 1700 to 1900. And so he identified 1,500 Hamlet images. Then we figured out which lines of text they illustrated. And if you make a chart, of course, some lines are more than others, and most lines have no illustration, right? You wouldn't expect each individual line. So this is the one that has the most. There's Alas Poor Yorick, as the most. And in our collection, there were 103, 105 items, or 15%, or 6% of the total. And I often use this with students. Then you have a parade of images down the side. I still often use this with students because they tend to fall into categories. There are the famous ones tend to be solitary, where someone is meditating on life, death, and other stuff, right? But then you have some really engaging communal ones, or ones where their characters are gathered around the skull rather than Hamlet meditating on it. And so that's something valuable about having access to. We thought it was impressive, 103. Now, if you look that up in Google now, you get even more, right? Probably for that line. There are also things in the collection like another line that's highly illustrated is angels and ministers of grace defend us when the ghost appeared. Right, so this is Garrick, and everything about this was discussed for 100 years or so. You know, the sleeves, the posture, the imputed emotions. So you get this cycle where the illustrations in books, which this is, affected performance, and that performance then rolled into the artistic and graphic representations of the play, and evolves through time. And so people were looking at Garrick. And this, there's so many jokes in this material. Probably about 25% of the artwork is comic in one form or another. You know, either making fun of great actors or Shakespeare or one another or so on. And this is kind of one of those. That's Garrick again. But the rumor was that he had a wig maker make a spring-loaded wig where the hair would pop up when he saw the ghost. So sort of, because there's a line about standing on end, you know, what makes your hair stand on end like the quills upon the fearful porpentine. It was a spring mechanism. I don't know if it's true, but that was the legend, and someone illustrated it for that. And again, here's an example of how an incredible degree of weight was placed on tiny details of performance which were discussed, like in this case, this is a more stable figure, and you can see that by the lack of tension in the sword. Right? This guy's more upset. So the descriptions in the reviews would say things like Mr. Keene pressed his sword into the ground with resolve, or whatever the critic wanted to impute to it. And so in a sense, people were already comparing these things to other performances in the past at the time when these illustrations were made. Then we moved to Burton. That was one where we had permission, and to several others. But for the classroom side, and this is an example, though this was originally in HyperCard stacks rather than cleaned up the way it is here. But we made HyperCard stacks that linked all of the existing Laserdiscs of Shakespeare plays, which numbered about 45 at the time, every 3 lines, to the corresponding text on another HyperCard stack. So you would click on the stack, we'd have 2 monitors, and two Laserdiscs, 2 monitors, and a computer. And you could have a choice between 2 different versions of Hamlet or Henry, or actually not Henry V, of Hamlet or Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, or the plays for which there was more than one Laserdisc published. And then you could push a start-stop button, record that time code, and put it into an essay for replays. And it immediately started to produce work that was different from what I had expected. So one student came up to me, and after playing with the software for a little while, this was very early on, and said, oh, we think we have a great idea for a paper. It was two young women. And I said, what is it? And she said, well, it's about the hand gestures in Henry V, in Olivier's Henry V. And I said, well, could you tell me a little more? She said, yeah, we have a typology of 17 different ones. You know, the imperious point. And they had names, you know, the pompous, this, the divine blessing. So they named these things, and they tabulated them. And I thought, well, that's very MIT, but in writing class, you have to have a thesis. So they say, oh, we have a thesis. It's that, what is it? It's that of these 17, at least 5 are run through in a 30-second period at moments of climax. And so I'm not sure we've quite gotten to the literary meaning yet, but I see what you mean. Go ahead. And in fact, they did make conclusions about what it meant that there was these run-throughs of these. Oops, sorry. Seem to have lost my cursor.
Where is my gracious Lord of Canterbury?
Okay, so this is the questioning one, but then it grows into by the end of the scene, and I think you'll start to remember this if you've seen the film. A gesture to the heavens for God, right before God, we are coming on, and a gesture of inclusion finally to the audience, right? That where this demand for information and this commanding gesture becomes an inclusive one that involves the global audience itself. Well, actually, I made up that part. They got halfway there, but when you're teaching, I didn't make it up. But they were suggested, and I said maybe you could push it a little bit in this direction. And in fact, it became very illuminating, especially since in the wooing scene at the end of the play, many of these things are reversed and ironized and seem awkward, when he's still doing this kind of stuff, but he's supposed to be wooing lady, and he's doing his best maybe, but there are still these gestures of power and imperial inclusion after all. He's the center of it. So they got to that kind of material as well. So, and I think this is what I really love to do with these kind of things, is start with performative details and work towards a meaning rather than love in Romeo and Juliet. Who knows about love? And most of us probably don't think we do. But we can count hand gestures. Let's start there and see where we get. So I was going to skip a lot of projects in between, but in 2007 we started the MIT Global Shakespeare's video archive. And this is a video archive rather than a fully linked hypertext. And I started this originally. I got an offer to apply for a grant from a foundation to take the work that I've been doing in any direction that I wanted to, and it was a rather substantial grant from a small family foundation. And so I thought Global Shakespeare would be the way to go, and I had a number of colleagues who were already working on Asian Shakespeare, notably Alexa Wang, now at George Washington, and Li Lan Young, National University of Singapore. And they'd been interested in Asian archives for a good while. So we started with Asia, but then at a certain point, Singapore stayed with the Asian archive, and Alexa and I continued with a more global mandate. And this is our front page, though we have a new interface coming along. And we like this notion of a matrix of choice or playlist, two-dimensional playlist. And at this point, we have 120 complete theatrical videos up, 300 hours, 20 countries. We have 95 up and 120 that we have in the pipeline. We do some YouTube clips, but of course we want the distinctive character of our going around the world and collecting stuff to stand out, so we just use them to fill in when we feel it would help the project. At first it was Asian, now it's still, if you put the greater China countries together, is still predominant, but the country with the most is Brazil now. And we built that up as well. And so we have teams of editors, and sometimes just a single editor, but more often 2 or 3 editors in a region who collect and who send us stuff. and we put it online. We've not done everything. We've not done very much with translation. So only a rather small fraction are fully translated into English, which of course we have to do. But we wanted to build this first, so that's how we built the Global Shakespeare Archive, and I'll give you a few samples of this. And our experience has been that it's helped. We have 20 or 30 editors altogether, and it has helped our presence at conferences to what would you say, coalesce. In other words, the presence of people working on global Shakespeare is greater. Now it's really grown immensely. But when we started in 2007, we got nothing but complaints about why are you using the term global? Don't you know global capital is what comes to mind? We said, yes, we know that, but there's also global Shakespeare. But at the time, there was a kind of mood in the profession that made that somewhat suspect, you know. And but we thought that it was implicit in Shakespeare's own intention, so we resisted. We kept the name, and the aim of the project for me, and I think for the other editors as well, is not just to get a lot of stuff online from a lot of countries, but to change the paradigm. Change the paradigm from a center and reception model to a more dialogic one, right? To a multi-voiced, multi-directional conversation. The reason for this is, first of all, that's the way culture works, you know, and Shakespeare is being appreciated all over the world and remade all over the world. Yes, you could always say New York, London, and Stratford are the best, but you'd be wrong, actually. And so, you know, for one thing, and that was the main thing that inspired me, was that the work coming out, in particular out of East and Southeast Asia, was much more innovative, much deeper in its inquiries into what the Shakespeare play was than the Royal Shakespeare Company or than the National Theatre's productions or than the New York productions, right? It was innovative, exploratory, multimodal. I'll show you some examples of those kinds of things. So that in a sense, we really have to try to abandon the old, at least to my view, the older model that, yes, some countries are doing pretty well in putting on Shakespeare, and understand it as a global phenomenon that has many directions. Some of them funny, and some of them amusing, some of them not. Suleiman Abbasam is one of the important practitioners in this. Let's see, I thought I had a video. Yeah. So this is a this is an Al Jazeera covering of Richard III and his rise. Suleiman has also worked on Al Hamlet Summit, in which Ophelia is a suicide bomber, and Hamlet is a kind of wavering radical trying to decide where he felt naturally, where he fits in an Islamic revolution, and the ghost is a nasty British arms dealer, right? Who comes, but the real ghost, so there's kind of two ghosts. One is this arms dealer who tempts the young man to violence, but the other is the ghost of Nasser, the haunting the Arab world with the vision of Arab nationalism that has not been embodied in the world in the way that they had hoped at that time, but lingers over so much thought in the region about what could have been and what they need to live up to and so on. So fascinating analogs are found for this. And that, so one thing one's learned is that many areas in the country, in the world, in which the political side of Shakespeare is dominant. That's what they see in Hamlet. You know, we don't see it as well. So a book like Margrethe de Grazia's Shakespeare without Hamlet without Hamlet is very refreshing because it does talk about the dynastic matters. It does talk about Hamlet in history. It does talk about the loss of the British Empire and its roots back to Troy, and therefore perhaps the loss of the West as a whole as the 16th century ended and apocalyptic fears about the takeover of the West by Asia were voiced even in books like Raleigh's History of the World, right? Who thought that the three kingdoms are now coming to an end and the fourth would probably be from Asia. So some of these ideas are really in Shakespeare. We don't attend to them. We attend to the psychological much more in Hamlet studies. Another thing is the way in which there's a variety of engagements with the popular that are local but are transferable. And this is a great example. This is before the current wave of global Shakespeare. Grupo Galpao put on Shakespeare in the countryside and touring Brazil, and their stage would be the top of a Volvo station wagon or whatever that is, or a Jeep, right? And they would wear clown makeup as a kind of link with still surviving traditions of clown-based theatricals in Brazil and in popular forms. And they took that production to the Globe in 2001. And this is, I seem to keep losing my cursor. Here we are. And a charming production. And when this production finished in 2001, Mark Rylance, who was then the director of the Globe, came out and addressed the audience, and he said, you know, these people are doing what it is we wanted to do and don't know how to do, which is to do popular Shakespeare, to address ordinary people, and to make it work as an experience for everyone in ways that we need to learn from. So he singled them out as there were a number of touring productions, and in the passage of time, I think that's led to what are now plans in Brazil for a Globe Theater there, and even conceivably two in two different locations. So, and team members from the Global Shakespeare Archive are active in those discussions and decisions. This is another Brazilian one, and this group is what you just saw was they're actors, but they work they tour for the people out in the country. But this is a group called Nós de Morro, We of the Hillside, and so these are people who all live in their regular daily lives in the shanty towns on the hillsides of Rio, where the poor people live in the hills rather than the wealthy people living on the hills, favelas. And they put on Shakespeare, and they've been doing it now for, I think, about 15 years. About 500 people have come through it. And it derives from those activist traditions in Brazil, in education, which you've probably heard of, and in lots of other ways, of Paulo Freire and other inputs into that. So it's a kind of activist theater and a continuing institution. And their work is fascinating. I just want to show you a little bit of this. No, it's got to be this one. watch the way the people emerge from the backstage. Okay, so one of the interesting things here is the way they use the awkwardness of the emergence of the characters from the backstage. And they do it in a way, and it's kind of it's a continued trope throughout the production. It's about a kind of orderly but unmannerly struggle, to get into that playing space, which is they are conditioned in a sense, right, as emergent artists, but also demonstrates over and over the way in which you have this wonderful figure who Wall, who here is played by a woman, and she arranges things. It's so you have this kind of bustle and people shoving and pushing, and then these moments of working it out, resolving, making everyone finally gets on the stage together, and it's so their blocking embodies these democratic values. That's what they're doing, and it's easier to see when you compare it to one of its sources, which is the Michael Hoffman Midsummer Night's Dream. I don't know if any of you notice or know the film, but many of the costume details, but not the blocking, are straight out of Hoffman. So they're not only in dialogue with their own people, with the middle and upper class audiences that they address, as well as their own people, but also with international film. And so that's them. And this is the Michael Hoffman. All sorts of things. The length of the wig, the shape of Sam. What's his name again? Who plays Thisbe in the, I forgot his name for the moment. The shape of his face. This Kevin Kline figure in the short tunic is Pyramus is accoutred and dressed and his body language very similar to the other one, and the Wall sort of tops it off. So they're really, and this is highly formal, where the mechanicals are terrified, as indeed in many Midsummer Night's Dream productions, they're terrified, right, of getting executed for accidental dirty jokes which they can't help making all the time, and so on. So right, or for anything that they might do. And the Brazilian troupe is not. The guy comes out and says, if we're here to offend you, that's because we want to offend you. You shouldn't think that we're here for any other reason. And that has that kind of half-truth that positions the audience in a very different way from the cinema audience here, where there really is a very restrictive code that these mechanicals have to follow. So these are some of the kinds of conversations that happen. Here's another example is from the Korean production of Midsummer Night's Dream, the Yohangsa Company, and this black background, I keep losing it. These are spirits, right? Fairies, but they're dokkapi. They're spirits in Korea of disused objects, right? Not of dead people. And from the old days, it might be a plow that broke and remains as an oppositional spirit to mislead travelers along the way, and so on. But everyone, at least according to our Korean editors in Korea, knows about these things, and they survive, and even are referred to. Somebody might say, "Dokkapi broke my cell phone," or something like that, into contemporary contexts. It's a very short clip. Okay, so one theme is the ways in which the possibility of global exposure and global touring and presence on an archive like this is one side of the story, and the other is the local story or the regional story, national story of what kind of social negotiation is going on in these global Shakespeares in relation to their own traditions, which are in part their meal ticket, right? But in another way, something that they're questioning or trying to find one's roots in, or some other relationship. So it's always a complex, multi-directional conversation that's going on. I don't think I'm going to go. I want to get to a couple of other things, so I won't go through this. But this is a Brazilian Hamlet that where the ghost is wearing the traditional cowrie shell headgears of the orishas, of the spirits in the candomblé religion. And of course the troupe don't believe in this religion. They are university types, but they're having a conversation around and within and with it. And this is a Hamlet, a wonderful, wonderful Hamlet, Ryutopia Hamlet from Japan. And the leading idea is that Hamlet never moves on the stage. Like a figure in a no drama, he might be dead. He might be returning to life, to rehearse or revisit episodes in his life. And he only wakes up every once in a while when something catches his attention. So the play goes on around him. And if he needs to act or stab somebody, there are these, which he does, and the script calls for it. The actions are done by karakuri, which are human beings playing 18th century mechanical dolls. And that's how, so when Polonius is stabbed, or, the duel scene, it's done by young women with fans. And they're actually dressed as wind-up toys from the 18th century. And Hamlet just sits there, right, until the very end where he kind of orders the action. So this is using a tropes, local tropes, right? He's something like a Buddhist monk. He's something like a TV samurai, He's something like a number of things. But the main mode is, what if Hamlet doesn't move as the kingdom is lost, and never moves, but his voice is very strong, and he wills at the end of the play. I mean, it's an amazing thing, and in doing that, takes control of it. It's as if he's finding what my colleague John Dower wrote about in his book on post-war Japan, embracing defeat, embracing defeat to the point where you create a new cultural life out of that. So again, these are important engagements with Shakespeare. They're not sort of just, and they can reveal things about the text. Going to skip a few. I want to speak briefly. Do you have a little more time? Is that okay? About Wu Xingguo, who is my favorite, really, of the international Shakespeare artists from Taiwan, Taipei. And I want to start not with Shakespeare, but with Kafka. And the reason for doing this is I'm angry that he got such bad reviews in Edinburgh for his adaptation of Metamorphosis. They had no idea what he was doing and no patience. If a foreign artist comes to Edinburgh and does Shakespeare, the critics are used to it. If he does Kafka, they say he's not doing the real Kafka, And what he was doing was tremendously sophisticated. They didn't even try to understand theatrical. I saw this in the National Theater in December in Taipei, and it was one of the 2 or 3 great things I'd ever seen. I was anyway. This is one aspect. This is the big bug, right? The woodlouse. But the woodlouse crossed with the general from that Wu played in his Beijing opera career with the Beijing opera grand general type, right? And in fact, he's got another set of feathers. You can see the pink ones at the top, and they are antennae but they're also the long feathers of the Beijing opera general, which is where Wu made his reputation as the best Beijing actor opera artist in Taiwan. But he's rejected and refined and altered that persona. So this is the scary bug that Gregor Samsa becomes. But there's another bug that Gregor Samsa becomes, and that's the minimalist, empty bug, And this comes more from Western traditions of minimalist art and theater. You can see the little bug face on the bottom of the body, and he's in some sort of bondage. But in one production, he goes, from one extreme, the kind of full grandiose bug in Kafka, to the empty one. And he's drawing on the hunger artist, He's drawing on the hunger artist. He's also drawing on Kafka's diaries and letters, as well as, because the ambition very often with an artist of this caliber who's reworking Western classic is to have a conversation with it. And the conversation is, Wu thought that Kafka's Metamorphosis was too bleak, that you could go even deeper into the bleakness if you allow the other side to emerge, and the other side can be read in Kafka's love letters, for example, right? So that would be the Tao, that would be the yin and the yang, the balancing. I feel passionately that this work is incomplete. It can take another form, and that other form can be an improvement, right? Not just how do we do another reading of Kafka's Metamorphosis. So this is the Lear is here that he's most famous for, and the story is this is his original kind of costume that he might have worn in the Beijing opera, and the central device of this production is that Wu gives up this. He plays Lear in a solo dance, right, with just half a dozen lines for 20 minutes. And then at the end of it, he tumbles on the floor, he's exhausted, and presumably dies. But it's only the first act, it's only the first scene. And when he wakes up, he doesn't know where he is, and he takes off the costume. And this had never been done on the Beijing Opera stage ever, where a performer would take off the costume on the stage. It's like a profanation, right? But that's what he had difficulties with his mentor, who was very, very strict, and he left the theater for 2 years. He went to France and studied with Ariane Mnouchkin, and she said, why don't you do King Lear? And why don't you do it as a one-man show, which he did. And so in this production, he takes off, it's like Lear divesting in those so many, many ways that Lear divests on stage. Let's play a bit of it. The sound's very low. I don't think you'll be able to hear it. So, who am I? Does any here know me? This is not Lear. So he goes through that, but he goes through that in an autobiographically inflected version of his own experience and his own loss of his art in order to refine that in some form. So we made that the subject of our first online module. It's not a MOOC, but it's an online module with a study plan and the ability to clip and just like we had in the Laserdisc days, things and weave them into your own essay. And I wanted to show you a very brief clip and what a couple of students said about it. So this is the meeting of Edgar and Edgar and Gloucester. Gloucester's recognizing that he's in the presence of his father who wants to kill him, and he's disguised as a mad beggar. But in Wu, it's the same person. So one assignment was show a moment when character changes from one character to another. So this is Gloucester, and you'll see he uses this stick as a transition. So as he crosses the stick, he also covers his eyes. And Gloucester is blind, but it also allows there's always a tiny moment of privacy, intimated some way as one character morphs into another, and that's part of that. And it could have other meanings as well. So a number of students, this was the favorite one that they picked for this short assignment. And I just wanted to pick two of the responses, two tiny pieces of description. And these are kids that never took a Shakespeare course before, MIT freshman or sophomore. And his facial expression changes. It becomes almost pained at the prospect of leading his father to the cliffs. However, he composes himself before talking. And I thought that was really remarkable. So getting to the emotional core of this, right? So you see the pain, and then you see he kind of settles himself. So they're watching the acting. They're watching the meaning being created. Not they're saying, there's a theme of filial abandonment, or something. So you see, I don't like abstractions much. So, but that's they're getting to the real heart of the matter. And then I read Lillian's comments second, and they wrote them separately, but it seemed to answer the first one and amplify it in a way. Edgar's reaction to his father's condition is a mixture of shock, anguish, and pity. So it's more complex, right? It's not that's what pain becomes broken down into those things, and which he not composes himself, suppresses. So she reads that gesture as can't go there, can't do that, right? Got to stop. And to me, this is the kind of thing that can get you closer to what is. And then she gives it the motive, that is, identity needs to be continues to be hidden. Gets us much nearer to the text, and we can see this artist working this way. We can see that you don't need to understand Mandarin to get this out of the production, and you don't need to worry about it being a one-man play to understand that this medium of the one-man play in Mandarin, mixture of Ariane Mnouchkine and Martha Graham and Beijing opera, can illuminate Shakespeare for you. These are the kinds of conversations that are now going on. So I'm going to skip largely to the end. We'll skip the Hamlet module, but I have to show you what we're doing to try to link archive. First, there is now Taiwan Shakespeare database. Their material will appear in Global Shakespeare Archive. Our material will appear there, and we're working out principally design ways of answering the question, how can a person have the choice of saying, okay, so I've got this material, and I see that it's credited to Global Shakespeare, which all these titles are, but how can I feel I'm still working in Beatrice's archive, in the Taiwan one, right? And when do I choose to kind of have my experience recentered in the global context, right? So rather than talk about just how to find this material, we spend a lot of time on design. But when my main employees, well, very part-time, was the creator of MIT's every daily changing web page for 15 years, the originating designer and manager of that, Susanna Lisanti. And so we believe in design. So we believe a lot of the ways of doing things you can continue to link, but you want to use it to have the option to switch into the other environment, or stay where they are, and they know that in either place they can get all the stuff that they need. I mean, this is the challenge, and we think it's not so hard, and we're mocking up designs to do that. In this case, made easier because they like the same matrix as we did. This is a little harder. This is brand new, just a week old. Is the first Shakespeare Digital Brazil, again created by with Liana Leal, who's our main editor in Brazil, and they have their own website. And we're sharing. She was interested in actor interviews and Shakespeare scholar interviews, probably a lot more than we are in the United States of having Shakespeare scholar interviews. So Susanna trained her and others in video production, video shooting, and then they went to various conventions and meetings and did a round of filming. As Tina Packer, there are Shakespeare scholars like Peter Holland and Jim Shapiro and other actors as well, Brazilian as well as global, and now they have their own website. And these are co-produced, and we'll share all those, all the footage that they made of these interviews, as well as the Brazilian productions that they've already given us. So we're trying to promote this notion of linking. And I wanted to finish with a very quick sense of what it would be like to move from a single line in one of us, another partner archive, Hamlet Works, that we've been working with for a long time, but haven't embodied our working with. We haven't done much except we house them, and they, they are listed as an allied archive. But the intention is to create something in between the two archives. So this is a famous crux line when Hamlet's about to kill the king, but doesn't, and it's in one of these imaginative, multi-textual instantiations. So you get Q2 and F in the same line. Now might I do it, but is a praying, or but now is a praying, or now might I do it, Pat, now he is a praying, he is praying. So you either do it but or you do it Pat, and there could be a world of difference, right? Because Pat means like right now, right? But means, well, but maybe I won't, right? So there's kind of a world of difference that's possible there.